Today I'm speaking with Dr. Peter Singer. Dr. Singer is a professor of medicine at the University of Toronto and a special advisor to the Director General of the WHO. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Singer.
Thank you, Sri Jane. It's great to be with you.
So, just starting off right from the beginning here, where did you grow up and what were your early years like?
I grew up in Toronto. My parents were refugees. They escaped from Hungary in 1956 at the time of the revolution. And they also went through the Second War and were Holocaust survivors. And so that had a big imprint for me, and it did shape what those early years were like. I was super fortunate to be born in Canada, and those experiences led me to a couple of things. It led me to an utter hatred of injustice and human rights abuses, which we saw both in the Nazi and in the communist regimes. And it also led me to a love of Canada and never taking for granted the opportunities that this great country provides for refugees, for newcomers like my parents.
Yeah, and I can definitely relate to that myself. My parents being immigrants as well. My parents brought us here to Canada because of the revolution that was happening in Nepal and the disruptions to our education. So I can very much relate. I think we have similar stories there. And What was your academic journey like? Just start, so you can start from anywhere in terms of if it was elementary school, like in terms of your education.
I went to high school in Toronto, to good high school, Upper Canada College. Always felt like a bit of an outsider there, carrying on the theme of immigrants and refugees. And then spent a couple of years at the University of Toronto in undergrad, went to medical school there, did my internal medicine residency there, and then started to do some fellowships in medical ethics at the University of Chicago in 1987 before it was a thing.
Mhm.
And then in public health at Yale. Then I came back in 1990, 89, 90 to my first job, really as a clinician scientist in medicine at the University of Toronto. And that interest in bioethics, which was really my first career, was triggered when I was in grade 13, because we had grade 13 then, by a fantastic high school biology teacher, Doug Blakey, who's turned into a friend. He was also the principal of UCC, who assigned in 1978 an essay on ethics of experimentation with human subjects. That was way before bioethics was a thing. But it was also a good sign of how a great teacher can make a huge difference in someone's career.
Wow. And as a child, what did you aspire to be? Was the goal always sort of the medical route, or was there a different path that you saw for yourself as when you were younger?
It's a super interesting question, because I think it provides a lesson for folks. As refugees, as immigrants, that experience is usually very tough on the parents, on the immigrants, and they're doing it for their children. And I was an only child, and I felt a real sense of obligation to my parents. My dad died early when I was 11, and so I was the only child of an only parent, my mom, and her refrain was one of stability.
Mhm.
You should be a doctor, dentist, or lawyer. And
Right.
ultimately, I turned into a doctor. But I guess my point is that led to kind of less risk than I might otherwise have wanted to take in that choice. So I did want to be a doctor. I love being a doctor. I saw it as the best liberal education you could ever get, because you see people at their worst and most vulnerable, and you're there to care for and help them. But that kind of doctor, dentist, or lawyer refrain
Yeah.
just shows you how your opportunities, or even your sensibilities, or the way you think about things, can be shaped, maybe unduly shaped, into too low risk an approach early on in your life.
Right. And speaking a little bit about those sensibilities, how do you think the values and customs that have been instilled in you from your background and your experiences have informed the person that you are today, both in a personal sense, but also a professional sense?
I already mentioned the kind of hatred of injustice,
Mhm.
and that really stuck with me as I later became a social entrepreneur and essentially went on to find problems and solve them. And those problems were things that really just struck me as unjust, unfair, and I wanted to do something about them. In addition, I had a very fortunate upbringing to have a very loving relationship with my parents, and then for a long time with my mom,
Mhm.
who, as an only child, built up a lot of confidence in me,
Right.
and maybe too much confidence. And I'm going to provide this as a negative example. When I was younger, because of that shaping, I probably was overconfident, didn't listen enough, didn't really take feedback. And that's something that over the years I sought to improve and change because, in fact, it doesn't matter where you start. What matters is how much you listen to the views of others, to the feedback that you're getting on your approaches, because that's really the only way to improve. So in a sense, I almost had to undo some of that confidence. It was great to have that confidence and to be able to strike out as a social entrepreneur, but I almost had to undo some of the overconfidence part, the over part of the confidence, to really be able to take feedback, and that's what we've tried to instill in our kids as well, the opportunity to just listen and improve, because everybody can always do things better. Everything's always a success and a failure.
Mm. Yeah, that's actually a very interesting comment because there was this recent comment from a NBA basketball player, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and it was a big conversation around this topic of what failure is because the reporter asked him a question that framed because they had been eliminated from the playoffs, of do you consider this season a failure? And his response was that it was highlighting that nothing in if you as long as you gave it your best as 100% really, then that's not a failure, right? Defining it as failure sort of invalidates all of your work that went into it. It's sort of puts you into an unhealthy spiral where you think that if you don't win every time and if you don't get what you want every time, then it's failure.
Yeah, I agree with that. Early on, I wrote a piece in the British Medical Journal called "Learning to Love Failure," and certainly after that, that was in the context of medicine and learning to love mistakes, learning to love failure. And certainly after that, in Grand Challenges Canada, which basically funded innovations in global health, you have to embrace failure. The issue isn't whether you fail or not. I think this is really super important advice for people, young people, especially as they're starting out. The issue isn't whether you fail or not. Everybody's going to fail. The only issue is whether it's fast and cheap and you learn from it.
Mm.
So the more you embrace failure, the more you can improve. And that's just an extension of the point we were talking about earlier about taking feedback and learning as you go.
Right. And sort of switching off a little bit into the world of global health, and the world that you operate in, what is global health in your own words, and why is it so important?
There's some various definitions around, but why don't we just say it's the health of people all over the world,
Mhm.
and that and it's so important. We saw why it's so important during COVID-19. And we learned from COVID, the 3+ years when the whole world suffered through COVID, why global health is so important. More than 20 million people died, the worst public health catastrophe anywhere in the world, anywhere in history, probably in the last 100 years. It affected people everywhere in the world. So we're all interconnected. No country was safe. And in some ways, the so called developing countries did better because they had muscle memory of dealing with epidemics and outbreaks. But it also showed how health is central, not only to health, not only to, let's say, international development, but also to the economy. It brought the world economy to its knees, and also to national security. It really fanned up tensions, spurred polarization within countries, exploited the fault lines, the political fault lines within countries, and in fact, we're left with a tear in our social fabric that needs to be mended. We don't listen to each other well enough. Things are polarized, and we've got to do something about that, because it's that social cohesion, it's that trust in government, in each other, that actually is the best foundation for pandemic preparedness and health. So health is not just an issue in health; it's an issue in economics, it's an issue in national security, and that's why global health is so important.
And I've talking about that interconnectedness, it very much relates to the SDGs of how the way that the SDGs have been constructed, the just for people listening as well, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals set out by the WHO, it connects each one of the Sustainable Development Goals with each with all within each other. Speaking of that, what do you think are some of the key aspects of global health which should be understood, whether they relate to the SDGs or other things?
Well, you're right to point it to the SDGs, which are um, the 17 goals, 172 targets set by 194, 195 countries in the world in 2015 to be met by 2030. And in particular, your point that they are universal, and that means they apply to everybody. So it's not just here's some goals for poor countries and so on. They apply to everybody, and that's also a key lesson of COVID, which is we're all in this together. Solidarity was at the heart of or lack of it was at the heart of the ethics of COVID. The top three lessons of COVID were equity, 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 which is very much central to the Sustainable Development Goals, with the kind of leitmotif of leave no one behind. So the idea of universality, the idea of equity at the center, and also the idea of political support, the 194 countries, and measurable results. And that's where a lot of our focus is these days, because the SDGs are lagging so far behind. The question becomes, how do you speed them up as a political matter, as a financial matter, but also as a technical matter? And that's probably one of the main questions facing the world right now. And finally, Srijane, for those people whose eyes glaze over when you talk about abstract things like the Sustainable Development Goals, just imagine a woman who's dying in childbirth who doesn't have to die. Imagine a child who's dying on the first or second day of life who doesn't have to die. That's what's at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's what it's about.
Right. And you mentioned this very important word, which is equity. I think people hear this as a buzzword, and it can lead to some sort of a political association with that word. But to you, what would that word mean, equity?
To make it not a buzzword, let's talk in concrete examples.
Right.
Vaccine inequity. The distribution of vaccines around the world during COVID was extremely unfair. More than 80% of people were vaccinated in high-income countries. In many low-income countries, less than 20%. Modeling that was published in Nature estimates that inequity alone resulted in more than 1 million deaths. Imagine that. Imagine that, because you're giving it to lower risk people in high income countries and not higher risk people in low income countries. That's what accounts for that distribution effect. But imagine 1 million people dying simply as a result of the inequity. That's what it means. Or to take a more local example, in Toronto early in the pandemic, the Black community in Toronto insisted to the city that disaggregated data be collected. And it turned out, as they had anticipated, that the death rates and the attack rates of COVID were several fold higher in the Black community. But they didn't stop there. They then organized and used that data for screening programs in the community, for vaccination programs in the community. And so it's a great example of how inequity is not necessarily just an abstract buzzword. It's actually the beginning of a set of measurements and actions that can lead to saving lives. That's what it's about, whether it's in the vaccine situation, whether it's in the example of the Black community in Toronto, either the global or the local examples. Inequity kills, and
Mm.
community mobilization around inequity saves lives. That's what's at the heart of that thing that could otherwise, as you rightfully point out, be just a buzzword.
That, I think that's a great, really definition of what equity is. And from your experience, what are some common misconceptions surrounding global health, if there are any? I imagine there's a bunch.
Well, probably the most important goes to the issue of solidarity.
Mhm.
Is it about diseases that are way more common in developing countries um, than in high income countries? And then we're going to focus, obviously, on a certain subset of infectious diseases, all of which are important. Or is it diseases that kill the most people? Most people would be surprised to find, for example, that non-communicable disease like cancer, heart disease, um, and so on, stroke, respiratory disease, they kill 70%
Mhm.
of the 60 something million people that die every year in the world. That's global health.
Right.
And, I think where that leads is a recognition that global health has been overly colonized, if you will. There's a real othering, a real us them element to it historically. And maybe a more fruitful version of global health, or if you will, a decolonized version of global health, is one where the end goal is self reliance.
Mm.
Self reliance of every country, every community, every region in the world, so they can tackle their own problems. That's why, Sri Jane, I've been so interested in innovation my whole life,
Mm.
because innovation is a path to prosperity. It's a path to jobs. It's tapping into the creativity of young people. It's solving your own problems. And I mean, using innovation as a problem solving method by young people in countries themselves. Um, so I think it leads to the idea of self-reliance. That's, concrete example of that is the idea that to really address vaccine inequity, to really make sure you have vaccines, you probably need to make it yourself, at least at the regional level, which is what the WHO mRNA technology transfer hub is about. So, that's a misconception about global health. Let's call it the us them misconception, the othering misconception. It makes you feel better, makes you feel superior, but it's not a very helpful approach. And by the way, that's a comparative advantage of Canada. One of our biggest shames, but also one of our greatest assets. One of our biggest shames is what happened to the Indigenous communities of Canada over the history of Canada. But one of our biggest assets is the creativity and the wisdom and the knowledge of Indigenous communities. And so, if using that Indigenous ways of knowing and being, actually, if you will, to decolonize global health, address this us them issue, is a strategic asset that Canada can have. A point, by the way, we made in more than a decade ago in Canada's first strategy in global health that was done by the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences.
Right. And speaking also a bit more about COVID-19, how do you think that what kind of effects has COVID-19 had broadly on the world of global health, but also more specifically on the ability for capacity building and sustainability within the public health slash global health sphere?
I'd like to think that it really highlighted the importance of solidarity,
Mhm.
really highlighted the importance of we're all in this together. I'd like to think that it highlighted the importance of the World Health Organization. I mean, the voice of equity of my friend and brother, Dr. Tedros, and how he always, for more than 3 years, came back to considerations of equity every time he had one of his 241 global press conferences during COVID. Um, or now as we take the lessons and we try and encode them, if you will, into a pandemic accord and the negotiations that are going on among member countries, which hopefully will culminate in a pandemic accord in 2024, so we can not only learn the lessons, but we can apply them. I think those are some of the effects,
Mhm.
but it also goes deeper. Our social fabric is torn.
Mm.
We are more divided. Canada is, many countries are, the world is. than we were before COVID. And we have to mend those tears in the social fabric. We have to listen to each other better in communities, mayors, and really learn to listen to the voices of the other, and especially the people who've historically had disadvantage. We need to find common cause because that's really the only way any of us is going to be safe and just and right.
Right. And uh, maybe as another pathway towards a solution is what should governments globally be investing in and investing the greatest amount of resources in for the future?
Yeah, I mean, the narrowly on the issue of pandemics, let's say, and then I'll broaden. People talk about the 5 C's, and uh, that's collaborative surveillance. So how do you actually figure out an epidemic is turning into an outbreak is turning into an epidemic, and how do you characterize that, share the samples, et cetera? Collaborative surveillance, community mobilization, because public health starts and ends in communities. Clinical scaling up clinical care, as we saw the importance of clinical care during COVID. Um, the idea of countermeasures, we've already talked about that. That's drugs, vaccines, diagnostics, devices like medical oxygen, how to distribute them, and most importantly, I think how to make them, at least at the regional level, to make sure that you have them. And then finally, coordination. And
Mm.
so on COVID, and at the heart of the negotiations, both on the pandemic and on the international health regulation amendments, you can think use that taxonomy. More generally, I think it comes back to the question we were talking about before, which is, okay, the sustainable development goals are really lagging. About of those 172 targets, maybe about 50 are related to health. And you can boil them down into 3 constructs: healthier populations, which is the multi-sectoral stuff like water and sanitation, nutrition and stuff; universal health coverage, which is service delivery and financial protection; and health emergency protection. And those 3 things are lagging. So, for example, universal health coverage is going at best at 1/3 of the pace needed to reach the target by 2030. So, if it's going so slow, the question is, how do you speed it up? And you need the thematic approaches, be that the pandemic accord, be it the approaches to promote universal health coverage. But you also need to think about the systems that cut across all those themes, and can speed them up. And to me, those are data and delivery for impact, innovation of various kinds, including technology like the COVID vaccines, but also service delivery, like, for example, mental health service delivery, and the Friendship Bench in Zimbabwe, where grandmothers are delivering cognitive behavioral therapy to people on park benches because of the shortage of psychiatrists,
Mm.
and also partnerships. So I think the question is, how do you speed up the SDGs? You've got a basic foundation in political commitment and leadership and accountability, equity, and gender equality and human rights. But on top of that, there's implementation, which is both the standard approaches to those themes in health and the ways to speed stuff up, like
Mhm.
data and delivery, innovation, and partnership. So to me, there's a narrower thing about a focus on COVID and pandemics generally, and making sure that we learn those hard-won lessons with more than 20 million people dying. Those are lessons that must be learned, and we do so when we apply them. And more generally, I think the fundamental question is, how do we actually speed up the sustainable development goals in the ways we've just discussed?
Right. And you were speaking just right now about the triple billion approach. What role do you think policy and systems play in the work that is necessary to speed up the SDGs?
Super important. I mean, it's all about policy and practice at the end of the day. It's execution, 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 implementation at the end of the day. The comparative advantage of a place like WHO, of course, is you do things immediately at scale. It's the only place in the world where 194 governments come together and agree
Mm.
on issues of health, and the leadership that goes with that. By the way, there's 3 comparative advantages of WHO. That's one. The normative function is the other, the guidelines, the data, et cetera. And the third one, most people don't realize, it's the 150 country offices and that very strong country platform and the trust between governments and WHO. Anyway, I think those are the ways to really speed things up. It relates very much to your question about health policy, health systems. At the end of the day, it's about implementation. On the health systems thing, I mean, what's important, and Tedros talks about this all the time, is a fundamental commitment to primary health care, which means not only service delivery, but also communities, multi-sectoral. And you can see that even during COVID, you know, the countries that had primary healthcare systems with epidemic surveillance built in, even if they weren't very rich countries, countries that had primary healthcare systems that engaged communities. So they trusted the government when the government said, okay, wear a mask because of the transmission of COVID. You know, these are the elements that really, in health systems and practice, that was your question, health systems, health policy, that are super critical. And then finally, technically, there's no other place in the world other than WHO where you could actually, where countries, member states can actually negotiate and agree on a convention, treaty, accord, or other international instrument that that can be used to make the world safer.
It's interesting when you were speaking about the three sort of advantages of the WHO, comparative advantages. One and the interesting part that I guess I'd never actually thought of, which is that the WHO is really a giant solidarity building machine. Just having people from different countries, different cultures working in close proximity with each other, it inherently builds collaboration and opens the door for partnerships. So, and it brings people closer. It's yeah, it's something that seems very obvious, but something that I don't think most people, because I think most people when they think about the WHO and its functions, they think about it, okay, you know, health programs, and as a large multilateral organization that implements these programs, but it's also really a, a place that brings together, or an organization that brings together hundreds of countries and cultures.
That's a great insight. And people from those countries to work closely together. That's
Right.
a great insight, Sri Jane. Yeah.
And as a special advisor to the WHO Director General, what kind of work have you and do you take part in currently?
You know, initially, I was on Tedros' campaign team.
Mhm.
So that work was about an election. It was actually the first time I was involved in politics because that was one country, one vote, like a Security Council election. This is back in 2016, 2017. Then he asked me to stay on as his special advisor. Um, I like to joke that I went to Geneva for 2 weeks 6 years ago. And uh, the role I played then is I architected the strategy called General Program of Work 13 with the triple billion targets you mentioned, a billion more people living healthier lives, billion more people with universal health coverage, billion more people better protected from health emergencies. Um, so that took about a year through the approval of that in 2018 by member states. And then, and since then, I've been working on just the very things we talked about, you know, the smaller scale versions, the pilots of, and basically by supporting teams and leaders in those teams, and including and especially young leaders in data and delivery for impact, in innovation of various kinds, in partnerships of various kinds in the multilateral system, in civil society with private sector, because I thought those were the practical ways that could speed things up through implementation. But you needed to test them. You can't just declare them. And so we've got actually some very important experiences that can be scaled up now, not only for health SDGs, but across the SDGs. And there's an SDG summit coming up in September, where I think some of those experiences could be shared. And then, of course, with the COVID pandemic, I supported Tedros in any way that he needed, and focused in quite hard on vaccine inequity in some of the ways that we discussed. It's been a great learning experience for me. It's been a huge privilege to be able to do it and to learn, as you say, from colleagues all over the world and to gain an appreciation for why the world needs a World Health Organization. As
Mm.
many people point out all the time, it's certainly not perfect, but no organization is perfect, and it is an essential element of global health, of health in the world, of pandemic preparedness, and it's been super interesting for me, and it's been almost a fourth act. I mentioned earlier on I was a social entrepreneur. That's the arc of my career. I started out by being a professor of medicine and doing bits of research like in end of life care, et cetera. Then the second act was I co-founded a bioethics center,
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately came around issues of global health ethics. The third act, and that was the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics. The third act was to co-found Grand Challenges Canada, which supported more than 1,000 innovations in more than 90 countries, mostly from innovators in those countries themselves and young people. Innovations with impact to save and improve lives. And then the fourth act was the great privilege of going to WHO as Tedros' special advisor to really to support him and his leadership on the SDGs and on the other things we've discussed.
Yeah, you've had quite a journey. And on this journey, you've been, as you mentioned, involved with and started Grand Challenges Canada, and you've started a Center for Bioethics, and then now at the WHO. What would you say are some of the vital lessons that you have, the maybe two or three vital lessons that you've learned in your journey?
And this also I think is lessons I've learned, but things that let's also say it maybe is useful career advice for young and not so young people. And I've written about this in my blog, which people can read at singerp.substack.com. The top lesson for me is find a problem and solve it. There was always a problem that I was solving. And so, for example, when I was doing my internship, we were caring for a woman in her 30s with cervical cancer, and she was dying. It was widespread cancer, unfortunately. And I realized that I could rattle off, 20 causes of low phosphorus in the blood. But when it came to whether or not we were going to resuscitate her, it was a very, process where you didn't really engage her. You kind of scribbled it in pencil on the nursing cardex. This was in the early 1980s. And so I spent the next 10 years of my life trying to improve quality end of life care as a result of find a problem and solve it. So that's the top advice. The second advice is get the right mentors working for you. So, it's a very hard question to answer. What do you want to be in 10 years? But it's an easier question to answer. Name 3 people who are doing something like what you want to be doing in 10 years. And I would encourage everybody to do that bit of homework, reach out to those people, ask them for career advice. And if you like it, turn them into mentors. Little side note, mentorship historically has been used to entrench injustice and privilege. But it can be a super powerful pro-equity measure too. I spend a lot of my time talking to young people and providing career advice through the blog, through podcasts, and then also one-on-one. So anyway, get the right mentors working for you, number 2. And number 3 is leverage your platform or hop aboard a rocket ship. For me, the rocket ship was the Gates Grand Challenges in Global Health. In late 2002, I found myself, we'd written with my dear colleague Abdullah Dar a piece on top 10 biotechnologies in global health. And I got a call from the Gates Foundation. They were thinking about launching this Grand Challenges in Global Health program. And they realized that they could use the method we use to identify the top 10 to identify those Grand Challenges. And so I joined the scientific board. We did some work helping to identify the Grand Challenges in global health. And that ultimately led to a similar experience when I got a call in 2008 on the day of the federal budget from a finance official saying, you'll be interested in the budget today. And that was the initial funding that ultimately turned into Grand Challenges Canada in 2010. So my advice to young people, because these are the lessons I've learned through that career arc, is find a problem and solve it, get the right mentors working for you, and leverage your platform or hop aboard a rocket ship. And again, way more detail on these things in my blog at singerp.substack.com. And I'd love for people to read it and get back with their feedback and engage on social media on some of these questions. Why? Because the only way to create a better future is a vision of hundreds of thousands of young people around the world solving individual problems.
Mm.
That's the way to make a better world, and that's why I've spent a lot of time trying to focus and support young people from all walks of life, because talent is global, but opportunity isn't.
Mm.
To me, that's the single most important path forward, because the SDGs are only as good as the people solving them. And that means you need people close to those problems everywhere in the world, and especially young people, and especially women, and especially people who haven't been able to apply their talents to the degree to which might be merited.
And we'll definitely link the your blog underneath this video as well for anyone who wants to check it out. And
Thank you.
yeah, and just a little final section here on your favorites. Just a quick rapid fire section here. So, what is your favorite film?
Favorite film is probably Annie Hall, because of that scene where they're in the line and there's somebody pontificating about the movie and quoting Marshall McLuhan, and Woody Allen goes behind a billboard and pulls out Marshall McLuhan. He says, "Watch, I have Marshall McLuhan right here," and he says, "You're full of bullshit." And I like that because it shows, we should really focus on the power of the idea and not the person pontificating. And so that's my favorite film, and because of that scene.
Nice. And what would be your favorite food?
I love Chinese food.
Chinese. Just and what is your favorite hobby?
Love to ski.
Nice, nice. There must be some great slopes out in Geneva. And what is your favorite band, artist, or group to listen to?
I'm going to give two. One is the Beatles,
Mm-hmm.
classic, but secondly is Wagner, who was a horrible person and a terrible anti-Semite.
Yeah.
And made magnificent music.
Yeah, yeah. Our artists can, their art can be amazing, but they can be monsters. I think we're starting to learn this in recent years. And what novel or book would you recommend for young people listening to read? And what are you currently reading?
Here's a great book by my friend David Senge. David is it's called Radical Inclusion. Mm-hmm. David is the education minister of Sierra Leone. And it tells the story, it's really a leadership story. It tells the story about how David mobilized opposition to the ban on pregnant girls attending school and reversed it. And now there's an education law in Sierra Leone that's radically inclusive. And so there's a lot of lessons in here on equitable leadership, because radical inclusion is the path to equity. So since this was published last week, published by Melinda Gates, I think it's the first book that she's published under her imprint. I'll just give a shout out to my dear friend David Moinina Senge, and his new book. Why? Because I think it can be super helpful to people listening.
That sounds like an amazing story, and I will be picking that book up. I definitely recommend everyone listening to please pick up that book as well, because I think we have to support people who are doing great work, and buying that book is certainly a great step in that direction. So thank you very much, Dr. Singer, for joining me today.
Srijay, it was great to be with you. Thank you very much. And good luck to all your listeners. That's where we're all counting on exactly the type of people who listen to your program to find a problem and solve it and make the world a better place.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you.